The April air was cool enough to fog the windshield of Marcus Johnson's Honda Accord as he turned onto the quiet suburban street. He wasn't planning to stop, just passing through on his way from a site inspection, but then a glint of silver caught his eye. Parked brazenly in front of his daughter's colonial-style house was a Lexus he knew too well. Margaret's Lexus, his wife's Lexus, the car that should have been resting safely in their garage 10 miles away. A slow burn tightened in his chest. 25 years of marriage had given Marcus instincts he trusted. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He killed the engine and sat still for a moment, letting the hum of silence settle around him. Through the half-open curtains, faint voices floated into the night air. He pushed the car door shut without a sound and walked to the side of the house, footsteps cautious on the stone pathway. The window was cracked just enough to let him hear. "When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for." Margaret's voice drifted out, sweetened with the kind of laughter that once lit up his darkest days. But there was poison in that tone now, sharp and deliberate. Marcus froze. His pulse pounded so hard he thought they might hear it. For a moment he told himself he must be mistaken, that the woman he had met when she was a shy secretary in a downtown law office could not be speaking about him that way. But then came another voice, calm, measured, legalistic. Daniel Thompson, his son-in-law, a lawyer, a man Marcus had welcomed into his family. "The timeline is perfect," Daniel was saying. "File in June. Claim irreconcilable differences. With the statutes on our side, Margaret gets half the marital assets and lifetime support. Add in the racial angle and the court will sympathize. A controlling black husband, intimidating with money. The stereotype works in our favor." Marcus's hands trembled against the brick wall. The words cut deeper than betrayal of marriage. They stripped away decades of struggle. He had built his company with sweat and dignity, carrying bricks when no one would hire a black contractor fighting for bank loans while white businessmen were waved through. Every board nailed, every paycheck earned had been a battle to prove he was more than the stereotype. Now the people closest to him were preparing to weaponize that very stereotype against him. Margaret's laugh floated again. "He still thinks I love him. 25 years of playing the devoted wife. He'll never see it coming." For a second, Marcus couldn't breathe. The woman he had trusted with his soul was mocking him, conspiring with a man who once called him Dad. Rage threatened to surge, but years of negotiating contracts and masking emotions in boardrooms forced him back into control. He pulled his phone from his pocket, thumbed the record button, and held it steady near the window frame. If they wanted war, he would need proof. Inside, Daniel's words sharpened. "We've documented everything. Bank statements, deeds, valuations. The court won't question it. By September, you'll be free, wealthy, and respected, and Marcus will be left with nothing but his pride. And we both know how much that's worth." Margaret murmured something he couldn't catch, then laughter again, lighter this time, almost giddy. The sound Marcus once thought was joy now rang like a victory chant over his ruined trust. A twig snapped under his shoe. He cursed himself silently. The voices stopped. Chairs shifted. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered. "Probably the neighbor's cat," Daniel answered after a pause, though his voice carried suspicion. "Don't worry. He'll never suspect." Marcus pressed himself against the wall, forcing stillness into his limbs until the conversation resumed. He listened for another 15 minutes, recording every word, until the tension in his muscles turned to steel resolve. When he finally slipped back into his car, the world he had known for 25 years had shattered. But beneath the devastation, something colder took root. The instinct of a man who had faced prejudice all his life, who knew survival depended not on tears, but on strategy. He gripped the steering wheel, staring at the Lexus in the driveway. The car gleamed under the streetlight, a symbol of everything he had provided: comfort, security, luxury. And now it stood there like a mocking trophy of betrayal. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying his breath. They thought he was blind. They thought being black meant being naive, easy to outmaneuver. They were wrong. For the first time that night, his hands stopped shaking. Marcus remained in the driver's seat for a long moment, his phone still recording in his trembling hand. The suburban street was quiet, its lampposts casting pale pools of light across neat lawns and trimmed hedges. To any passerby, it was a peaceful neighborhood. But through that half-open window, poison dripped word by word, reshaping everything Marcus thought he knew about his marriage, his family, and his worth. Daniel's voice cut through the night like a surgeon's scalpel. The paperwork is simple. Iowa courts are clear. We emphasize control intimidation. Judges lean toward protecting women, especially white women married to black men with wealth. The optics work. Your testimony will seal it. Marcus clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. There it was, spoken plain. Not just betrayal, but a plan to exploit the color of his skin, something he had fought against every step of his life. They weren't only conspiring to rob him. They were going to drag him into court as a living stereotype. The domineering black husband, the abusive provider, the man who couldn't possibly have earned success except by manipulation. Margaret's voice followed, calm and mocking. He thinks being generous proves he's a good man, but generosity makes it easy to paint him as controlling. All those gifts, the vacations, the house, they'll look like tools of manipulation when I explain it the right way. Her laughter lanced through Marcus. He remembered the sparkle in her eyes when they signed the papers for their first modest home. The tears she shed when he surprised her with a trip to Paris after their 10th anniversary. Every memory soured, reframed as part of a performance she had been perfecting for years. Daniel's tone grew firmer. The key is the narrative. The judge doesn't need proof of bruises. Financial abuse is enough. Denial becomes guilt. If he resists, it shows control. If he stays silent, it looks like intimidation. Either way, we win. Marcus hit the phone's stop button, then quickly started a new recording. Redundancy was survival. He shifted slightly, peering again through the curtains. Margaret reclined on the couch, champagne glass in hand. Her posture relaxed in the very house where their daughter should have felt safe. Daniel leaned against a bookcase, gesturing confidently with a manila folder bulging with documents. Marcus's documents, his empire cataloged and reduced to exhibits for his own destruction. 2 years of meticulous betrayal wrapped neatly in a lawyer's rhetoric. Marcus forced himself to withdraw before his anger betrayed him. He slipped back to his car, breathing through clenched teeth. The door clicked softly shut, but his pulse thundered in his ears. He set the phone carefully in the passenger seat, its glowing screen showing the length of the recording over 40 minutes of evidence. Enough to expose them if he played it right, but a part of him wanted to storm inside, confront them both, demand explanations. Then he remembered every negotiation where contractors underestimated him, every bank officer who double-checked his credit because he was a black man asking for a loan. Those battles had taught him emotion was weakness, strategy was survival. Tonight was no different. If he went in raging, he'd become the very caricature they needed him to be. The front door opened. Margaret stepped out first, her designer bag dangling like a prize. Behind her came Daniel, straightening his tie with lawyerly precision. Their faces shifted when they saw him sitting there, shock-panic calculation. Margaret's smile snapped into place too quickly, brittle as glass. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" His own voice sounded foreign to him, practiced and smooth. "Just finished a job site inspection nearby. Thought I'd stop by and see Brianna." Daniel's eyes flicked over him, searching for cracks, measuring whether Marcus had heard too much. Margaret filled the silence with quick lies. "Brianna's not home. I was just helping Dan with some paperwork for a client." "Paperwork?" Marcus almost laughed. "Paperwork to erase a lifetime." He rose from the car, feigning casualness, though his hands still tingled with adrenaline. "Well, don't let me interrupt. I'll head home. Dinner won't cook itself." He let the words hang, watching Daniel's eyes narrow at the sight of the phone in his hand. Did they suspect he didn't care? Let suspicion fester. It would only push them into mistakes. As he drove away, Marcus replayed fragments of what he had captured. Margaret's mocking tone, Daniel's cold legal strategy, the ugly invocation of his skin color as a weapon. Each word hardened his resolve. They thought they were building an airtight case. They had no idea he was already several moves ahead. The night closed in around him as he pulled into his own driveway. The house loomed familiar yet alien, every brick laid with love now shadowed by betrayal. Inside, silence wrapped itself around him, heavy and suffocating. He set the phone on the kitchen table, its screen still glowing, the recorded voices trapped inside like poisonous ghosts. For the first time, Marcus truly grasped what he was facing, not just a divorce, not just a theft of wealth, but a war against his identity, his dignity, and his very place in the world he had built. He whispered to the empty kitchen, "They think I'm blind. They'll learn I've been watching all along." The night after Marcus discovered the betrayal, sleep refused to come. He sat in his leather recliner, the same chair Margaret had always complained clashed with her design aesthetic. Tonight, it felt like the only place left that belonged solely to him. His phone lay on the coffee table, still holding the recording that burned like a coal in his pocket. Every time he closed his eyes, her laughter returned, sharper than nails dragged across his skin. To fight the storm in his mind, Marcus drifted backward through memory. His life had always been about building brick by brick, contract by contract, sacrifice by sacrifice. Concrete had been his canvas determination, his only tool. He could still feel the sting of his first rejection. He was 21, standing in line at a local bank paperwork for a small business loan in hand. The white loan officer barely glanced at the application before sliding it back across the desk. "Men like you usually overestimate what they can handle. Men like you." Marcus carried those words like a scar. It wasn't about numbers, it was about the color of his skin. But he hadn't quit. He borrowed tools from cousins, took on side jobs, and started small fixing driveways, patching walls, painting apartments. Landlords didn't want to set foot in. Every paycheck went back into the business, every client became an advertisement. Slowly, neighbors learned that Marcus Johnson delivered what he promised. By 30, he had his first truck with his company's name stenciled proudly on the side, Johnson Construction. Even then, the barriers never let up. When he bid on city projects, his proposals were misplaced or not competitive enough. Meanwhile, less qualified white contractors walked away with deals twice the size. He'd sit in meetings listening to officials refer to him as one of the local boys, while his competitors were businessmen. Yet Marcus persisted. He wore down resistance with undeniable performance, finishing projects on time, under budget, and with integrity. He remembered the day he met Margaret. She was working as a secretary at a downtown law office. She'd laughed at one of his terrible jokes about cement mixers, her green eyes sparkling. At the time, he thought that laugh was genuine, a melody of possibility. When she agreed to dinner, he believed he'd found someone who saw him as more than a skin color. Their love felt like proof that the world could change, that interracial marriage was more than survival. It was hope. The early years were good. They ate ramen noodles when cash was tight. She stood beside him when he pulled all-nighters drafting bids. They celebrated their first successful city contract with cheap champagne and second-hand crystal flutes. Marcus let himself believe she was in it for the long haul, that her loyalty would stand against the whispers from her family, the side-eyed looks from neighbors who never quite accepted the black man on their street. And then came Brianna. The day his daughter was born, Marcus held her tiny body and felt the weight of two worlds in his arms. Biracial children often lived in the margins, but he swore his daughter would never doubt her worth. He would give her every chance, every opportunity, every tool to build a future free of the limits he had fought against. For years it seemed to work. He expanded Johnson Construction into multi-million-dollar contracts, securing not only his family's future, but also employing dozens of workers, many of them young black men who just needed a chance, the chance he'd been denied. Margaret enjoyed the fruits of his Labor Country Club memberships, vacations to Europe, designer handbags. Marcus never minded. Providing was his language of love, but as the wealth grew, so did the distance. He remembered subtle shifts, the way Margaret introduced him at parties as Marcus, my husband. He owns a construction company, always with a tone that reduced his empire to a handyman gig. Or how Daniel, fresh from law school, would ask loaded questions about Marcus's contracts, smirking when Marcus explained the intricacies of permits and bids. They had always been polite slights coded in civility, but Marcus had felt the sting. He had chosen not to dwell on them. Love, he told himself, was stronger than prejudice. He had been wrong. Now replaying Margaret's voice mocking 25 years of playing the devoted wife, he realized those moments were not accidents. They were cracks in the foundation of a marriage built on performance. She had taken his generosity as entitlement, his silence as weakness, his color as leverage. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He had spent a lifetime proving people wrong. The racist loan officer, the dismissive city councilman, the contractor who once told him, "You people aren't built for leadership." He had proved them all wrong with patient strategy and an unbreakable work ethic. And now the greatest betrayal came not from strangers or institutions, but from the woman who once promised forever. He thought of Brianna, her bright eyes, her fierce independence, her clinical way of analyzing people. Would she believe her mother's lies? Would she think of her father as another stereotype, controlling, manipulative, dangerous? Or would she remember the man who taught her how to ride a bike, who drove hours to attend every soccer game, who whispered bedtime stories about castles and architects? Marcus rose from the recliner and paced the room, his body buzzing with restless energy. He paused before the mantel where their wedding photo still stood. Margaret in ivory silk, radiant and smiling. Marcus in a rented tuxedo, awkward but proud. That young man in the photo had believed love would shield him from the ugliness of prejudice. That young man was gone. In his place stood a man who knew the truth. Love without respect was performance, and performance without integrity was betrayal. He picked up the phone again and stared at the glowing screen. The recording was his weapon now, but it was only the beginning. He would need more: proof of their financial collusion, evidence of Daniel's debts, patterns of Margaret's spending. Every lie, every whisper, every racist undertone would be cataloged just as he had cataloged every contract and invoice for decades. Marcus whispered to himself a vow forged in the quiet. They built their plan on stereotypes. I'll dismantle it with truth. For the first time in hours, he felt the clarity of purpose return. His life had always been about building foundations that could withstand storms. This storm would be no different. He would build his defense brick by brick until no lie, no prejudice, no betrayal could stand against it. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the wide bay windows of the Riverside Country Club, scattering across white tablecloths and crystal water glasses. Margaret had insisted for years that they join, arguing that networking was essential for a man of Marcus's position. Marcus remembered that first brunch vividly, the polite handshakes, the manufactured smiles, the subtle way conversations always seemed to leave him standing on the margins. He'd convinced himself it was nerves that he was imagining the undertones. But now, with the truth unraveling, those memories replayed in sharper detail. He saw himself again in that room, the only black man in a sea of polished white faces, wearing his best suit but still feeling like an uninvited guest. The women, including Margaret, compared handbags while sliding him little looks that said he would never quite belong. The men, well lubricated by Bloody Marys, spoke of rising property values and keeping neighborhoods clean. Marcus understood the code. They weren't talking about landscaping. He had tried to let it slide. For Margaret's sake, he'd smiled, nodded, bought into the illusion. But the comments never stopped. At a dinner party 2 summers ago, one guest leaned toward Marcus after hearing about Johnson Construction's success with municipal contracts. "You must have had some help getting those bids," the man said, voice casual, tone sharp. "You know, diversity initiatives and all that." The words were delivered with a chuckle, a wink as though he were paying Marcus a compliment. Margaret had laughed along, murmuring something about Marcus being lucky. Marcus had swallowed his anger with his wine. Microaggressions, they were silk gloves hiding iron fists. Never enough to call outright racist in polite company, but sharp enough to slice pride in private. Margaret, he realized, had shifted over the years from defending him to enabling them. She started echoing their language, repeating stories about how Marcus is so focused on work he barely notices trends. At first, Marcus thought she was teasing, but later he caught the sharper edges. She wasn't teasing, she was separating herself from him, aligning with those who saw him as a project made good, not a man who built his empire from scratch. Daniel fit right into that world. His polished suits, his practiced confidence, his ability to wield words like blades, all of it charmed Margaret's friends. He'd make comments about Marcus's old-school ways of running business, insinuating that Marcus didn't understand modern financial structures. They would laugh, Margaret included. Marcus pretended not to notice. Pretending he now saw had been his greatest mistake. At home, the shift was subtler. Margaret began to use phrases Marcus had only heard from outsiders. "You work like you're still proving yourself. You don't have to show everyone you're not from the ghetto anymore." She said it with a smile, but the sting was deliberate. The message was clear. No matter how many contracts he won, no matter how many homes he built, she still saw him through the same filter those country club women used. A man forever trying to climb into a world that didn't want him. Marcus now understood how easily she had slid into conspiracy with Daniel. Aligning with her white son-in-law gave her validation. Together, they could reframe Marcus's success as an illusion, something propped up by generosity, something that could be dismantled with the right legal language. And the courts Marcus knew were not blind to those same prejudices. The image of a black man controlling the money, keeping his delicate white wife under his thumb, was an old story they would happily believe. The worst part wasn't what they said in public. It was how Margaret rehearsed those narratives at home. He remembered once coming in late from a meeting, exhausted, dropping his keys on the counter. Margaret had sighed and said, "You know people think you're intimidating when you talk like that, so serious, so intense. Maybe relax a little." At the time, he'd thought it was marital advice. Now he realized it was rehearsal material, a future courtroom performance crafted one domestic line at a time. Marcus sat alone in his living room, those moments playing like a reel he couldn't pause. Every microaggression, every laugh at his expense, every dismissive word each was another stitch in the net they had been weaving around him. And yet he also saw something else, the opportunity to unravel that net thread by thread. Because Marcus had done what they never expected, he had listened. He had recorded. He had paid attention. If they wanted to lean on stereotypes, he would reveal their manipulation of those stereotypes. If they wanted to use microaggressions as weapons, he would expose them for what they were evidence of bias, not proof of abuse. He rose from his chair, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a leather-bound notebook. It was one of many he kept records of, contracts, negotiations, even casual notes about conversations that mattered. He flipped it open to a blank page and began to write. Every microaggression he could remember, every coded word Margaret or Daniel had used, every sneer hidden behind polite laughter. Not as complaints, but as documentation. Evidence that the prejudice wasn't coming from him, but aimed at him. His handwriting was steady. It was the same discipline he had carried since his first denied loan application. If the world doubted him, he would keep records so thorough they couldn't be denied. Tonight, that discipline would become his shield. As the list grew, Marcus felt something shift inside. The shame of those moments once buried transformed into power. They thought their laughter diminished him. Instead, it armed him. They thought their microaggressions isolated him. Instead, they gave him the clarity to see their strategy for what it was, a carefully crafted performance built on society's oldest prejudice. Margaret and Daniel had no idea the man they were underestimating had been preparing for this battle his entire life. Marcus set down his pen, closed the notebook, and whispered to the empty house, "They've mistaken my silence for weakness. Now it becomes my weapon." Brianna Johnson Thompson sat at her office desk, her diploma framed neatly on the wall behind her. Licensed clinical psychologist. Those 4 words had cost her years of study internships and long nights filled with the stories of broken families. She had counseled couples drowning in mistrust, children scarred by manipulative parents, victims gaslit into doubting their own memories. Yet nothing in her textbooks had prepared her for the slow realization that her own family was slipping into the same patterns she treated daily. It began subtly. Margaret, her mother, started calling more frequently often, under the guise of checking in. But the questions were unusual. "Do you think your father seems controlling with money? Have you noticed how tense he gets when you ask about the business?" At first, Brianna brushed them off, chalking them up to marital friction, yet the persistence grew unsettling. Then Daniel, her husband, joined the chorus. Over dinner, he asked hypotheticals that seemed oddly pointed. What if someone used finances to manipulate a partner? Would that count as abuse in a court's eyes? When Brianna raised an eyebrow, he smiled as though it were idle curiosity, but her instincts flared. Clinical training told her that repeated patterns of leading questions often signaled hidden agendas. Brianna had grown up straddling two worlds. To her father's black family, she was the light-skinned girl who would never quite know the struggle. To her mother's white relatives, she was the reminder that Margaret had married beneath herself. She had lived her life balancing mediating, trying to belong to both, yet accepted fully by neither. Her father had always been her anchor, steady, proud, unflinching, in his belief that she could define her own place. Her mother gave her love, too, but with strings, expectations of appearance, behavior, the right friends, the right man. And now that man, her husband, was speaking the same language her mother used, a language of suspicion, of manipulation, disguised as concern. One Saturday morning, Margaret invited Brianna to brunch at Café Luna, their usual mother-daughter spot. The place smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh croissants, a comfort Brianna cherished. But as soon as they sat down, Margaret leaned forward, voice trembling just enough to suggest vulnerability. "Sweetheart, I'm worried about your father," she said. "I think something's wrong with him mentally. He's been restricting my access to our accounts. It feels like control, like punishment." Brianna's clinical instincts kicked in. She set down her coffee carefully. "What kind of control has he threatened you?" Raised his voice. "Prevented you from making decisions?" Margaret hesitated, eyes darting. "No, nothing like that. But financial control can be a form of abuse, right? You've said that yourself." Brianna studied her mother's face, the slight delay in her answers, the rehearsed quality of her concern. She recognized the signs. This wasn't a confession. It was a performance, a narrative being tested. "Mom," she said softly, "are you asking me as your daughter or as a psychologist who could testify in court?" Margaret's smile faltered. "Both, maybe. You know how much weight your professional opinion carries." The realization landed heavy. Her own mother was trying to weaponize her career, her credibility against the man who had raised her, against her father. Brianna excused herself to the restroom, locking the stall door and pressing her palms against the cool tile wall. Memories flooded her father teaching her algebra at the kitchen table, cheering the loudest at her high school graduation, hugging her so tight after she passed her licensing exam that she could barely breathe. Was that man suddenly an abuser, or was she being recruited into a deception? When she returned to the table, Margaret's demeanor had shifted, softer pleading. "Brianna, you've always had such insight. If you could just support me on this, the court would listen. They'd believe me." Brianna's heart sank. It was no longer subtle. It was an ask, a direct appeal to betray the truth for the sake of family loyalty. She stirred her coffee slowly, hiding the storm inside. "Mom, I can't diagnose or testify based on assumptions. That would be unethical." Margaret's lips tightened. "So you'll side with him?" "I didn't say that," Brianna replied. "I said I won't be used." The silence between them stretched like a gulf. Margaret looked away, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee. Brianna recognized the tremor, not fear, but fury, contained beneath a fragile mask. Later that evening, Daniel tried his own approach. He returned home with Thai takeout and casual conversation easing into the topic. "Your mom's worried. She says your dad's been cutting her off financially." "That's serious, Bri. If it's abuse, shouldn't you step in?" Brianna put down her chopsticks, staring at him. "You keep using that word abuse. Do you know how dangerous it is to label someone without evidence?" Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Courts don't always need evidence. They need a story that fits. And you with your credentials can help tell it." Her stomach turned. The puzzle pieces aligned. Her husband and her mother were conspiring, weaving a narrative that used both her loyalty and her profession as weapons. She excused herself, claiming exhaustion, but once behind the locked bedroom door, she trembled with rage. For the first time, she allowed herself to question everything. Was her marriage built on love or strategy? Had Daniel chosen her for herself, or because she was the perfect bridge between his ambition and Margaret's resentment? As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one truth anchored her: her father deserved her clarity, not her silence. She would need to see him hear his side and decide for herself. Not as a daughter blinded by love, nor as a wife manipulated by schemes, but as a woman trained to discern truth from performance. For Brianna, the middle ground was vanishing. She could no longer belong to both sides. Soon she would have to choose. Marcus's home office had always been a place of order. Rows of binders lined the oak shelves, each labeled with crisp handwriting: contracts, tax returns, project bids. Framed photos of completed buildings hung on the walls, his legacy in brick and steel. But tonight the space looked different. It had become a war room. 2 laptops hummed on the desk screens, glowing with spreadsheets and financial statements. Legal pads lay scattered columns, carefully drawn assets, weaknesses, timeline, leverage. Marcus had never been a soldier, but years in business had taught him that survival required strategy. And now survival wasn't just about contracts. It was about his name, his daughter, his dignity. He leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The recordings were a weapon, yes, but no war was won with a single strike. Margaret and Daniel had already mapped out their attack, paint him as the controlling black husband-used stereotypes the courts were primed to believe. They thought they were playing chess against a man who barely knew the rules. Marcus would show them he had been a strategist his entire life. The first step was defense. He called Marcus Webb his accountant of 15 years. A black man who had started his career in the back office of a white-owned firm, Webb knew the sting of prejudice firsthand. When Marcus explained the situation, Webb's response was immediate: lock it down. Every joint account, every credit line, freeze them under standard security reviews. Legally airtight, she won't have access. By noon the next day, Margaret's credit card was declined at Riverside Country Club. Marcus pictured the scene, the flush of embarrassment, the whispers from friends she tried so hard to impress. For years she had wielded social power like a weapon, flaunting handbags and vacations as proof of her status. Now, without his money, she would discover how quickly those doors closed. It wasn't revenge, it was leverage. Step 2: intelligence. Marcus hired Mike Rodriguez, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion. A Mexican-American who'd built his career on exposing corporate fraud, Rodriguez understood more than most how the powerful used race and reputation as both shield and sword. Within days, Rodriguez confirmed what Marcus suspected: Daniel was drowning in debt. Student loans, an overpriced office lease, unpaid subcontractor bills. The man plotting to strip Marcus of his empire couldn't keep his own house in order. Marcus studied the report with grim satisfaction. Weaknesses, pressure points. Every man who postured with arrogance had cracks beneath the surface. All Marcus had to do was apply pressure. But he didn't stop there. He contacted Sarah Chen, his longtime financial advisor. Together they reviewed offshore accounts and estate planning structures Marcus had established years earlier, legal strategies meant for tax optimization, but now serving as shields. "Your wife won't even know these exist," Sarah assured him. "They're untouchable in a divorce. She's been cataloging the decoys, not the real treasure." Marcus almost smiled. Margaret had spent years rehearsing her performance, but she had been reading from the wrong script. Still, strategy wasn't only financial. This war was also about narrative. Margaret and Daniel were counting on the stereotype that a wealthy black man was automatically suspect, automatically controlling. Marcus knew he couldn't fight that alone. He needed allies who could counterbalance the whisper campaign. So he reached out. Lunch with Tom Bradley, the bank president and longtime golf partner. Dinner with Jim Morrison, a contractor who'd worked with Johnson Construction for decades. A quiet word at the Chamber of Commerce. Marcus didn't slander Margaret. He didn't mention Daniel by name. Instead, he spoke with the weary honesty of a man blindsided by betrayal. Family troubles, he admitted. "Seems some people I trusted may not have had my best interests at heart. I'm just trying to protect what I've built for my employees and my daughter." The responses were exactly what he hoped: sympathy, solidarity, quiet promises of support. Marcus had spent 35 years building not just structures, but credibility. That reputation would be his armor. Late one night, after hours of charting timelines and reviewing files, Marcus pushed back from his desk. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window-lined face, streaks of gray at his temples, eyes both weary and unyielding. He thought of his younger self, 21 years old, loan application rejected with a smirk. That young man had been dismissed, underestimated, told he didn't belong. And yet, he had built an empire. Now, decades later, the same prejudice threatened to strip it all away, not from strangers, but from the woman he had loved and the man he had welcomed as family. Marcus closed his notebook and whispered, "They think they know the rules, but I build rules. I build foundations, and this time I'll build one they can't tear down." The war room was quiet, but the battle had already begun. Margaret always prided herself on appearances. To her, status was measured not in kindness or loyalty, but in the rustle of designer shopping bags, in the way waiters at Riverside Country Club greeted her by name, in the sparkle of a ring flashed just so beneath chandelier light. For years, Marcus had supplied those appearances without complaint. He had considered it an act of love. But on Tuesday, at precisely 12:03 p.m., Margaret's illusion cracked. She had just finished her lunch with the other wives, a Caesar salad she barely touched, when the waiter returned with an apologetic smile. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm afraid your card has been declined." The words hit harder than any slap. Around the table, forks paused, eyes darted. Margaret's cheeks flushed as she fumbled for another card only to face the same rejection. She forced a brittle laugh, muttering about bank glitches, but the damage was done. Status evaporates quickly when money falters. What Margaret didn't know was that Marcus had already set the trap. Working with his accountant and the bank president, he had placed temporary security holds on every joint account, every line of credit, every automatic payment. It was perfectly legal standard protocol during marital disputes. But to Margaret, it felt like the floor dropping beneath her feet. By 12:47 p.m., she was calling Marcus in a panic. "Marcus, something's wrong with our accounts," she snapped. "My card was declined. Twice. The bank says there's a hold. Do you know anything about this?" Marcus kept his voice calm, almost bored. "That sounds serious. Maybe the bank needs to verify identities. I'll look into it." Her frustration bled through the phone. "Do it now." Do you have any idea how embarrassing this was? In front of Linda and Susan, Marcus hung up politely, promising to check, then return to his spreadsheets. For the first time in decades, he felt control shift back into his hands. But Margaret wasn't the only one caught in the floodgates. At 4:30 p.m., Mike Rodriguez, the private investigator, called Marcus from across the street of Daniel's law office. "He tried to access a joint account with your wife 3 times today. All declined. Then he went after a trust account looked like your daughter's education fund. That's frozen too." Marcus closed his eyes, absorbing the information. Daniel's desperation confirmed what the files had already suggested. He wasn't just greedy, he was drowning. Without access to Margaret's siphoned funds, his empire of arrogance was crumbling. By 6 p.m., Marcus was back in his office reviewing the day's battlefield, every account locked, every credit line requiring his authorization. Margaret and Daniel's financial lifeline had been severed. He thought of them scrambling Margaret with her social facade cracking, Daniel raging behind closed doors, both of them realizing the man they underestimated was playing a game far sharper than they imagined. That evening, Margaret arrived home late. Marcus listened to her heels click against the hardwood floor, her voice rehearsed into calm. "Long day," she said lightly, avoiding his eyes. "Bank mistake, I'm sure. It'll be cleared up tomorrow." But Marcus saw the tightness around her mouth, the way her hand trembled as she poured wine. She was unraveling piece by piece. And he knew something she didn't. The unraveling had only begun. Later that night, he sat in the war room with his notebook spread before him. The accounts weren't just frozen. They were a message, a controlled burn. Margaret and Daniel wanted to turn stereotypes into weapons, to cast him as the domineering black husband. Instead, he would show the court meticulous documentation, careful restraint, and proof of their deceit. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, Margaret had mocked his habit of keeping records, boxes of receipts detailed, ledgers, contracts filed by year and month. "You hoard paper like a pack rat," she used to tease. Now those same habits were his fortress. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across the room. The house was quiet, but his mind hummed with focus. This was no longer about saving money or property. It was about identity, about dismantling the performance Margaret and Daniel had crafted and revealing the prejudice festering beneath it. They had tried to turn him into a caricature. Now he would make them choke on their own script. The floodgates had closed, and with them the illusion of control Margaret and Daniel believed they held. The next move was theirs, but Marcus was ready. The following morning, Daniel Thompson sat in his downtown office, tie-loosened hair, disheveled fury simmering beneath his polished exterior. He had built a career on weaving narratives, on convincing judges and juries to see the world through his carefully chosen words. But Marcus's sudden countermove, the frozen accounts, the unexpected resistance had shaken him. He poured whiskey into his coffee mug and stared at the notes he and Margaret had drafted weeks earlier. Their entire strategy hinged on one thing, turning Marcus Johnson into a stereotype. It wasn't new. Courts, especially family courts, were fertile soil for prejudice. Daniel had seen it before, the way judges looked at black men with wealth suspicion etched into every raised eyebrow. Too controlling, too proud, too volatile. He knew the clichés by heart and had learned to weaponize them. Now he planned to use them against his own father-in-law. The script was simple. Margaret would testify about financial control, her voice trembling at just the right moments. She would recall arguments, real or imagined, where Marcus insisted on managing all the money. She would describe his seriousness as intimidation, his silence as aggression, his generosity as manipulation. With Daniel guiding her, they could transform acts of love into exhibits of abuse. Over lunch that day, Margaret rehearsed lines like an actress preparing for opening night. He insisted on paying for everything she said, her fork stabbing at a salad she didn't eat. He said it was love, but really it was control. "I couldn't even buy groceries without him checking receipts." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, courts don't need bruises. Emotional abuse, financial intimidation, it's harder to disprove. The stereotype of the controlling black husband will do the rest." Margaret smirked, her confidence returning. "It's ironic, isn't it? He thought being generous proved he was different, but it only makes him easier to frame." Daniel raised his glass. "To narratives, the truth is irrelevant. What matters is the story we tell." Across town, Marcus was crafting a story of his own. He sat with Sarah Chen, his financial advisor, reviewing documents. "They'll try to claim financial abuse," Marcus said. "I want a full timeline of every account, every transaction. Proof that she had unrestricted access for decades. Show how often she used that access for her own spending." Sarah adjusted her glasses, her tone brisk and professional. "We can build that record. Joint accounts, credit cards, property titles. It'll prove she was a partner, not a prisoner." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "This isn't just about money. They're going to lean on stereotypes. You know what that means." Sarah met his eyes. "Yes. They'll play the race card against you." "But Marcus, you've spent 30 years building credibility. Your reputation is stronger than their script." He wanted to believe her. Yet he knew how powerful the narrative could be. He had lived it his entire life, the contractor who assumed he couldn't handle a large project, the banker who double-checked his collateral, the neighbor who asked if he was the gardener at his own property. Society didn't need facts. It needed familiar stories. And Margaret and Daniel were preparing to hand them one. That night, Marcus replayed the recording again, headphones clamped tight. He listened not only to their words, but to their tone. Margaret's derision, Daniel's calculated certainty. Again and again he returned to the moment Daniel said, "With the racial angle, the court will sympathize." Marcus closed his eyes, fists tightening. They weren't just conspiring to steal his wealth. They were conspiring to erase his humanity, reducing him to a caricature that would fit neatly into the prejudices of a courtroom. But Marcus had his own script. He began drafting statements not just for lawyers but for allies in the community. He reached out to pastors, union leaders, former employees, all people who had known him as more than a stereotype. Their testimonies would counterbalance Margaret's performance. If she wanted to play the fragile white wife, Marcus would show the world the devoted father, the ethical employer, the man who had lifted others while lifting himself. The more he planned, the clearer it became. This wasn't only his fight. It was a battle fought by every black man forced to prove again and again that success was earned, not stolen, not sinister. They thought they could script him into silence. Instead, he would expose their performance for what it was, theater built on prejudice. Late that night, he opened his notebook and wrote one sentence in bold letters across the page. "They want me to be a stereotype. I will show them the truth." The war of narratives had begun. The knock on Marcus's office door was soft, hesitant. He looked up from the spread of files and legal pads to see Brianna standing there, her posture professional, her face unreadable. She wore the same calm expression he had seen her use with patients measured detached clinical. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course." She sat folding her hands carefully in her lap. "Mom says you've been restricting her access to money. She's calling it financial abuse." The words landed like a challenge. Marcus studied her face, the furrow in her brow, the guarded tone. She wasn't accusing. She was gathering data like the psychologist she had trained to be. "Is that what you believe?" he asked gently. Brianna hesitated. "I believe something is happening between you two that's more than just marital tension, and I need to understand it before I'm pulled into it any further. Both of you are asking me to take sides directly or indirectly. I won't do that blindly." Marcus opened a drawer and pulled out his phone. Without speaking, he tapped the screen, scrolling to the file he had listened to a dozen times already. He pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the office, venomous and unguarded. "The old fool doesn't even know how the system works. He still thinks I love him. 25 years of playing the devoted wife." Brianna's lips parted slightly, but her expression remained controlled. Then Daniel's voice followed, steady and clinical. "With the racial angle, the court will sympathize. A controlling black husband intimidating with money. The stereotype works in our favor." This time, Brianna flinched. Her professional mask cracked. The recording continued for nearly 10 minutes. Margaret mocking Marcus's devotion. Daniel outlining strategies, both weaving a plan to dismantle the life Marcus had built. When the file ended, silence filled the room. Brianna sat very still, staring at the floor. Finally, she whispered, "How long have you known?" "Since the night I found Margaret's car outside your house," Marcus said quietly. "I heard enough to understand what they were planning. I've been documenting ever since." Her shoulders stiffened. "They tried to use me, Dad. To use my credentials, my ethics to legitimize their lies. Do you know how it feels to realize your husband and your mother see you not as family, but as a tool?" Marcus's throat tightened. "I'm sorry you had to hear it this way." Brianna lifted her gaze. Her eyes, green like Margaret's but sharper, clearer, held both pain and determination. "I spent my life trying to balance both sides of this family, too white for one, too black for the other. I thought marrying Daniel was a bridge. Instead, it was a trap." She took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. "As a psychologist, I can tell you this, what they're doing is manipulation. They're weaponizing stereotypes, exploiting systemic bias. They want to twist generosity into control, loyalty into oppression, and they wanted me to validate it." Marcus leaned forward. "What will you do?" Brianna's answer was firm. "I'll tell the truth. In court, if it comes to that. I'll testify that Mom tried to recruit me into a false narrative and that Daniel encouraged it. But I won't be anyone's weapon. Not hers, not his, not even yours." Marcus nodded slowly. He respected her stance. It was the same integrity he had tried to instill in her since childhood, truth above convenience, justice above loyalty. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Brianna's voice softened. "Dad, do you know the hardest part of this? It isn't Daniel's betrayal. It isn't even Mom's manipulation. It's realizing how much of my life has been a stage play. Dinner parties, vacations, anniversaries, all scenes in a performance I didn't know I was part of." Marcus swallowed hard. "You and me both, sweetheart." She rose from her chair, straightening her jacket. "This ends now. I won't let them destroy you or me with lies. But you need to be prepared, Dad. They're desperate. Desperate people escalate. Marcus stood as well. For a fleeting second, he saw the little girl who once climbed into his lap to ask endless questions about the stars. Now she stood before him, a woman forged by both privilege and prejudice, ready to choose truth at great personal cost. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm proud of you. Not because you're taking my side, but because you're standing for what's right." Brianna's eyes glistened. She nodded once, then turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back. "Daniel won't take this well. He's not just fighting for money, he's fighting for survival. Be careful." When the door closed, Marcus sank back into his chair, the weight of her words pressing against him. He had expected Margaret and Daniel's betrayal. He had prepared for the financial warfare, but now the stakes were higher. A daughter's integrity, a family's fracture, the weaponization of race and reputation, all colliding in a courtroom yet to come. Marcus folded his hands and whispered to the silence. "They wanted to script me as a stereotype. Instead, they've given me a witness." Daniel Thompson had built his reputation on confidence. In courtrooms, he carried himself like a man who never doubted a word he spoke. But confidence is fragile when built on debt and deception. By late April, the facade was crumbling. Word traveled quickly in the construction community. Marcus had quiet allies in places Daniel had never bothered to respect. Subcontractors began whispering about late payments. Invoices left dangling for months. Rumors spread of Daniel dipping into client trust accounts to cover personal expenses. What had once been idle grumbling turned into formal complaints. Mike Rodriguez, the private investigator, updated Marcus over coffee. 3 subcontractors have already filed reports with the state bar. They say Daniel's been pocketing their money. The Bar Association is opening an ethics review. Marcus listened steady as stone. "That means hearings?" Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, and if they find what I think they will, he's looking at suspension, at best disbarment at worst." For a lawyer like Daniel, reputation was currency. Without it, his influence was gone. Marcus almost pitied him. Almost. Meanwhile, Margaret's world was unraveling just as quickly. At Riverside Country Club, silence followed her like a shadow. Women she once called friends now turned their heads at brunch. Linda Patterson, who had spent years sharing gossip with Margaret over cocktails, suddenly found her phone buzzing with urgent calls whenever Margaret approached. Even her bridge group dissolved without explanation. It wasn't loyalty to Marcus that drove them away, it was survival. No one wanted to be associated with scandal. Margaret had built her life on the fragile scaffolding of appearances, and now those appearances were collapsing. At home, Marcus watched carefully. She tried to mask her panic with brittle cheer, but her routines betrayed her. She spent hours on the phone with Daniel, whispering in urgent tones. She opened cabinets with more force than necessary, slammed drawers shut. The woman who once thrived on control was losing her grip. One night, Marcus overheard her muttering into the phone. "He knows. He must have heard something. I can't even buy gas without humiliation." Daniel's reply was muffled, but Marcus caught the tone sharp, commanding. "Then we escalate. No more subtlety. We paint him as abusive. The stereotype will carry us the rest of the way." Marcus wrote the words in his notebook. "We paint him as abusive." The script was tightening, but so was his evidence. Brianna, too, began noticing the cracks. When she visited her mother for coffee, she found Margaret uncharacteristically disheveled, her voice frayed with desperation. "Your father's losing control," Margaret insisted. "He's freezing accounts, making me beg for every dollar." Brianna sipped her coffee calmly. "Or maybe he's protecting assets because he discovered something." Margaret's eyes darted, then narrowed. "What did he tell you?" "Enough," Brianna replied. "Enough to know you're not telling me the whole truth." For a moment, Margaret's mask slipped. Fury flared across her face before she smoothed it into sadness. "Sweetheart, I'm only trying to survive. Do you know how hard it's been living with a man who never let me breathe freely?" But Brianna had seen enough patience to recognize performance when she heard it. She left soon after, heart heavy, but resolve sharper than ever. Back in his office, Marcus studied his growing arsenal. Financial statements, recordings, affidavits from subcontractors, whispers from the club. Every piece fit together like bricks in a wall. Margaret and Daniel had underestimated him. They thought prejudice would do the heavy lifting, but evidence was stronger than innuendo. Late that evening, Marcus stood at his window looking out over the city lights. Each glow reminded him of the buildings he had raised, the lives supported by his company. Those lights were proof of his worth, proof that no narrative could erase. He whispered to himself, "Let them push. Every crack in their armor makes my case stronger." The storm was coming, but Marcus had built his life on surviving storms. The Davenport County Courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. Marcus sat at the defense table beside James Morrison, his attorney and longtime friend, the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders. He had walked into countless boardrooms, negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, but never had he felt such a profound mix of anger and calm. This was not just a legal hearing. It was a mirror one that would reflect not just his actions, but the prejudices of everyone in the room. Across the aisle, Margaret sat with Daniel. She wore a conservative dress, hair pinned back, makeup softened to highlight vulnerability. Her hands trembled on the table, a performance Marcus recognized instantly. Daniel leaned close, whispering into her ear. His tie perfectly knotted his expression, radiating smug confidence. He believed the stage was his. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered, her gavel cracking against the wood. She had a reputation for cutting through theatrics, but Marcus knew even the most disciplined judges were human, influenced by story and image, and Daniel was a master storyteller. "Mrs. Johnson," the judge began, "you've alleged financial abuse by your husband. Please explain your concerns." Margaret's voice quivered as if rehearsed. "Your Honor, for months Marcus has restricted my access to money. He's controlled every purchase, monitored every account. Last week he froze everything. I couldn't even buy groceries." She paused, letting silence emphasize the indignity. "It feels like punishment, like intimidation." Daniel rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of financial abuse. A wealthy man using money as a leash, trapping his wife in dependency. It fits a pattern we see too often, especially in households where the husband holds all the power." His eyes flicked toward Marcus, deliberate. "This is about control." The words hung heavy in the air. Marcus could feel the weight of stereotypes pressing in the image of the domineering black man, the fragile white wife. He forced his breathing steady, his face calm. He would not give them the outburst they craved. James Morrison stood. His voice was quiet, but carried authority. "Your Honor, with all respect, what my colleague has presented is theater. We have evidence this is not financial abuse, but a calculated conspiracy. Allow me to submit Exhibit A." He pressed a button, and the courtroom filled with Margaret's laughter, recorded sharp and cruel. "The old fool doesn't even know how the system works. He still thinks I love him. 25 years of playing the devoted wife." A ripple of shock ran through the spectators. Margaret's face drained of color. Daniel stiffened, his practiced smile faltering. The recording continued, Daniel's own voice crisp and cold. "With the racial angle, the court will sympathize. A controlling black husband intimidating with money. The stereotype works in our favor." For 43 minutes, the audio spilled their conspiracy into the air, mockery of Marcus's love strategy sessions for asset division and the explicit plan to weaponize prejudice. Every word echoed in the high-ceilinged courtroom like a confession. When the audio stopped, silence followed. Judge Hendricks's gaze was stone. "Mrs. Johnson," she said finally, "do you have a response?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lawyer's coaching was useless now. Daniel whispered furiously, but the damage was irreparable. James spoke again. "Your Honor, my client is not a stereotype. He is a man who has built his company from nothing, who has provided for his family with generosity. The evidence shows he is the victim of manipulation, not the perpetrator of abuse. If anything, the abuse runs the other direction, an attempt to exploit his race, his reputation, and his wealth." The judge leaned back, her face unreadable. "I will review all evidence presented. But let me be clear, if this recording is authentic, and I have no reason to doubt it, then we are not dealing with financial abuse. We are dealing with potential fraud upon this court." Marcus's chest loosened for the first time in weeks. He glanced at Brianna, who sat in the back row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their eyes met. She gave a small nod, confirmation that truth still mattered. When the gavel struck again, Margaret slumped in her chair, pale and shaken. Daniel's mask cracked fury, spilling into the tight set of his jaw. For once, Marcus didn't feel like the outsider in the room. He felt like a man who had stared into the mirror of prejudice and refused to accept the reflection they tried to force upon him. The court adjourned, but the war was far from over. Marcus knew this was only the beginning of their unraveling, and he was ready. The courthouse hallway buzzed with the aftershock of the hearing. Reporters jotted notes, lawyers whispered strategies, and Margaret slipped away quickly, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Daniel stormed into a side-room phone pressed to his ear, voice rising with frustration. But Marcus stayed seated on a wooden bench, his hands folded calmly waiting. He knew she would come. Brianna approached a few minutes later, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her shoulders squared with purpose. Gone was the hesitation that had colored her voice in recent weeks. She looked like a woman who had chosen a side not out of loyalty, but out of truth. "Dad," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "I'm ready." Marcus turned to her, searching her face. "Ready for what?" "To testify," she answered. "To tell the court what Mom asked of me. To expose how Daniel tried to manipulate me into validating their lies. I've been silent too long." Marcus swallowed hard. He had wanted her support, yes, but he had never wanted to see his daughter dragged into this war. "Brianna, once you step onto that stand, there's no going back. They'll attack your credibility. They'll twist your words." She shook her head firmly. "Let them try. I won't be used, Dad. Not by them, not even by you. My testimony won't be about loyalty. It'll be about ethics." Her words carried the weight of her profession. Marcus nodded slowly, pride mingling with fear. "Then it will be the truth that saves us." The following week, the courtroom was fuller than before. Word of the recording had spread, and curiosity had drawn spectators. Margaret sat stiffly, her lawyer whispering frantically. Daniel looked like a man fighting to hold on to the last shreds of his power. When Brianna's name was called, the room shifted. She walked to the stand with quiet confidence, placing her hand on the Bible and swearing her oath. Marcus watched her every step, heart pounding. The questioning began. "Dr. Johnson Thompson," James Morrison said gently, "can you describe the conversations you had with your mother in recent weeks?" Brianna folded her hands, her voice steady. "My mother repeatedly suggested that my father was controlling finances to punish her. She asked me to use my professional credentials as a psychologist to support her claims of financial abuse. She wanted me to testify on her behalf without evidence." Gasps rippled through the audience. Margaret's lips tightened, her face pale. "And did your husband Daniel Thompson also speak to you about this matter?" Morrison asked. "Yes," Brianna replied. "He framed hypothetical scenarios about financial abuse, clearly intended to push me towards certain conclusions. When I resisted, he became more direct. He suggested that courts don't always need proof, only a narrative. He wanted me to provide that narrative." The judge leaned forward. "Dr. Thompson, are you saying your husband and your mother attempted to pressure you into presenting false testimony?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brianna said firmly. "They wanted me to legitimize a fabricated story that exploited harmful racial stereotypes. They intended to weaponize my father's identity as a black man and my profession as a psychologist to destroy his reputation." Her words landed like a hammer. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, whispering to Daniel, whose jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out. Then came the cross-examination. Daniel himself stood trying to regain control. "Dr. Thompson," he began smoothly, "surely you misunderstood our conversations. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted our concern for your mother's well-being?" Brianna's eyes were cold. "I didn't misunderstand. I know the difference between concern and coercion. I treat patients every day who've been manipulated. What you and my mother tried to do was manipulation plain and simple." The courtroom fell silent. For once, Daniel had no retort. When Brianna stepped down from the stand, Marcus felt tears burn his eyes. Not from relief alone, but from pride. His daughter had chosen integrity over comfort, truth over loyalty, justice over silence. That evening, Brianna returned to Marcus's home. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had once taught her multiplication and listened to her college dreams. "I ended my marriage today," she said simply. "When I took off my ring before court, I knew it was over. Daniel was never really my partner. He was a strategist looking for leverage. And Mom, I don't even recognize her anymore." Marcus reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You chose truth, Brianna. That's what matters. No matter what happens next, you stood for what's right." For the first time in months, Marcus felt hope settle in his chest. Not the fragile kind that could be broken by betrayal, but the solid kind, built on the strength of his daughter's courage. The war was far from won, but he was no longer fighting alone. For weeks, Margaret and Daniel had lived in a house of cards. The recording in court Brianna's testimony, the whispers in the community, it was all wind against a fragile structure. And by May, the collapse began in earnest. The first blow landed on Daniel. The State Bar Association issued a formal notice of investigation. Allegations of mishandled trust accounts, unpaid subcontractors, and misappropriated client funds piled into a case file thicker than any brief he'd ever written. The man who once boasted about his brilliance in manipulating loopholes was suddenly the subject of hearings where his polished smile held no sway. When his largest client, Miller Industries, terminated their contract citing concerns about professional discretion, the dominoes began to fall. Other clients quickly followed, unwilling to be associated with scandal. By June, Daniel's office was nearly empty, his associates quietly slipping away to protect their own reputations. He sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by boxes, the smell of stale whiskey in the air, his world shrinking with each passing day. Margaret's fall was quieter, but no less brutal. The women of Riverside Country Club no longer waved when she entered the lobby. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations dried up. Even the charity board, once her pride, regretfully accepted her resignation in a terse letter. Without Marcus's money to fund her image, Margaret was stripped of the one thing she valued most: social standing. At home, Marcus observed her unraveling with the detached calm of a man who had already grieved. She tried to mask her desperation with small talk, but her eyes betrayed her. When she rummaged through drawers looking for credit cards that no longer worked, when she snapped at the housekeeper for minor mistakes, Marcus saw the hollow shell of the woman he once loved. One night, after yet another declined card at the grocery store, Margaret erupted. "You've humiliated me, Marcus. Do you know what it's like to stand in line while people whisper?" Marcus stared at her evenly. "Do you know what it's like to hear your wife and son-in-law conspire to erase you, to reduce you to a stereotype so they can steal everything you built?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned away, no retort left to give. Meanwhile, Brianna was rebuilding her own life. She filed for divorce from Daniel, her petition citing irreconcilable differences, though she confided to Marcus that the true reason was betrayal too deep to forgive. She moved into a modest apartment downtown, decorated simply her wedding ring, tucked into a drawer she never opened. Patients came to her office daily, unaware that their therapist was quietly healing her own wounds between sessions. For Marcus, the community became his anchor. Longtime clients rallied around him. Workers shook his hand at job sites, murmuring their loyalty. Pastors and civic leaders reached out their words, carrying both comfort and respect. "You've stood tall through storms before," one pastor told him. "This time the truth stood with you." But the fall of Margaret and Daniel carried a deeper resonance. It wasn't just about betrayal or greed, it was about prejudice exposed in the harshest light. Their conspiracy had failed not only because Marcus had evidence, but because Brianna refused to validate lies built on stereotypes. It was proof that prejudice, when challenged directly, could be dismantled piece by piece. By July, Daniel faced formal disbarment. Margaret, cut off from her old circles, took a retail job at a department store, an irony Marcus did not miss. The woman who once spent thousands on handbags now folded blouses under fluorescent lights, her manicured hands stripped of jewelry. Marcus did not gloat. He did not need to. Their downfall spoke louder than any victory speech. One evening he sat on his back porch, the summer air heavy with the smell of cut grass. Brianna joined him, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the cicadas hum. "Do you ever wish it had ended differently?" she asked finally. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I wish the love I believed in had been real. I wish your mother had chosen truth over performance. But wishing doesn't build houses, Brianna. Actions do. And their actions tore down everything they touched." She nodded, her gaze steady. "And yours rebuilt it." Marcus looked out across the yard, the lights of his home glowing warmly through the windows. It wasn't the house that mattered, or the accounts or the contracts. It was the foundation, the truth, that stood when lies collapsed. The fall of Margaret and Daniel was nearly complete, but Marcus knew the story wasn't about their destruction. It was about survival, about a man who had refused to be a caricature and a daughter who had chosen integrity over blood, and that he thought was the only legacy worth leaving. In the weeks that followed the courtroom battles, Marcus understood that silence would no longer serve him. For 25 years, he had let others shape the story of his marriage, his place in the community, even his success. Margaret and Daniel had almost destroyed him, not with weapons, but with words. Now it was time to take those words back. His first step was small but symbolic. At the Chamber of Commerce luncheon, Marcus stood to give a brief speech before introducing the keynote speaker. Normally, he stuck to safe topics, construction forecasts, workforce training, but this time, he spoke from the heart. "Some of you may have heard rumors about my family." He began, his deep voice steady. Conversations hushed. Forks paused midair. "I won't repeat the lies. What I will tell you is this: truth matters. Reputation matters. And in a world where stereotypes are used as weapons, we must hold ourselves to a higher standard." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of men and women who had worked with him for decades. "I've built homes, schools, and hospitals in this city. But what I'm most proud of is the foundation of trust we've laid together. That trust carried me through a storm, and it will carry us into the future." Applause filled the hall, not polite but heartfelt. Marcus stepped down, knowing he had reclaimed a piece of his dignity. Next came the press. At first, Marcus resisted speaking publicly, but when local papers hinted at scandal surrounding the Johnson family, he realized silence would let others define the narrative. He agreed to an interview with the Davenport Chronicle, insisting it be on the record, no anonymity. Sitting in his office, he leaned forward as the reporter's recorder blinked red. "They tried to reduce me to a stereotype," Marcus said plainly. "The angry black man, the controlling husband." But the evidence showed otherwise. What happened wasn't just betrayal. It was an attempt to exploit racial prejudice for personal gain. That's bigger than my family. That's something we all need to confront. The article ran with the headline, "Marcus Johnson Fighting Lies with Truth." It spread quickly, and Marcus received messages from strangers, young black entrepreneurs, thanking him for standing tall women who admitted they'd been pressured into fabricating stories during divorces, even white businessmen acknowledging their blind spots. He didn't just stop at words. He created a new scholarship fund at Brianna's urging aimed at minority students pursuing law and psychology. "If we want to stop prejudice from being weaponized," Brianna explained, at the launch event, "we need more professionals of color in the system: lawyers, judges, therapists, people who see beyond stereotypes." Marcus agreed wholeheartedly. The fund's announcement drew community leaders, clergy, and journalists. Marcus stood at the podium beside Brianna, feeling the weight of his journey settle into pride. "This isn't about revenge," he told the crowd. "It's about building something better from the rubble. That's what builders do." Behind the scenes, Margaret's bitterness only deepened. She complained to anyone who would listen that Marcus had turned the community against her, but few listened. Daniel's disbarment had stripped him of status, and Margaret's own fall from grace left her clinging to old grudges. Marcus no longer responded. He didn't need to. The narrative was no longer hers to tell. For Marcus, reclaiming the narrative was not about proving Margaret wrong. It was about proving himself right, about showing his daughter, his employees, and his community that integrity still carried weight. The stereotypes his enemies had leaned on collapsed when confronted with evidence, dignity, and persistence. One evening, Marcus and Brianna sat on the back porch, the crickets humming in the humid night air. Brianna sipped iced tea, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "Dad," she said softly, "you didn't just survive this. You turned it into something bigger, Something good. Marcus smiled faintly. That's what builders do, sweetheart. We take what's broken and make it strong again. He leaned back, feeling the night air against his skin. For the first time in months, he wasn't strategizing or defending. He was simply living the narrative, reclaimed the foundation reset. The war was over, and Marcus had won, not by playing into the script written for him, but by rewriting it on his own terms. Autumn settled over Davenport with crisp mornings and golden leaves drifting across the streets Marcus had helped pave. Johnson Construction was busier than ever, contracts lined up months in advance. Workers greeted him warmly on job sites, grateful for steady paychecks in uncertain times. Yet for Marcus, the true victory wasn't in numbers or buildings, it was in the quiet peace that filled his home at night. Gone were the staged conversations, the forced laughter, the undercurrent of disdain. The house breathed again, every corner echoing honesty instead of deception. On weekends, Brianna often stopped by with boxes of files, helping him organize the scholarship fund they had launched together. Their conversations were no longer weighed down by suspicion. They laughed freely, worked side by side, rebuilding not just finances, but family. Margaret's presence had vanished from his daily life, reduced to the occasional headline or whispered rumor at the grocery store. He didn't gloat over her fall. He didn't need to. She had chosen performance over partnership, prejudice over love. The stage she built had collapsed under its own lies. Daniel, stripped of his license and reputation, left town quietly. Brianna signed her divorce papers with a steady hand, not in anger, but in closure. She was building her own practice, specializing in family therapy and manipulation recovery, a focus born from scars she refused to hide. Patients trust what's real, she told Marcus. And I know what betrayal looks like now. One October evening, Marcus walked the perimeter of a nearly finished community center his company had built. The building glowed with promised classrooms for after-school programs, offices for counselors, a gymnasium for kids who needed a safe place to play. It was more than steel and concrete, it was a foundation for the next generation. He paused at the cornerstone, engraved with a phrase he had chosen himself, "Truth builds stronger foundations." The words caught the last rays of sunlight, shining like a quiet vow. Later, sitting on his porch with Brianna, he let the hum of crickets and the smell of wood smoke settle into his bones. She leaned against the railing, her expression soft. "Do you ever regret it, Dad? The years with Mom?" Marcus thought for a long moment. "Regret, no. Without those years, I wouldn't have you, and I wouldn't have learned how fragile love can be without respect." He sipped his tea, the cool air sharp in his lungs. "But I've also learned that betrayal doesn't define us. How we rebuild does." Brianna smiled. "That's what you've always done. Build." Marcus looked out across the yard, the leaves swirling in the wind. For decades he had been underestimated, reduced to stereotypes, dismissed as a man who couldn't possibly have built his success without a hidden hand. And yet here he was, standing not on illusion but on truth. The betrayal that could have broken him had instead revealed his strength. He thought of the young men his scholarship would lift, the families who would gather in the community center, the daughter who had chosen integrity over convenience. Those were the true foundations, stronger than concrete, harder than steel. As the sky darkened, Marcus whispered a quiet prayer, not of anger or vengeance, but of gratitude, for survival, for resilience, for the truth that had saved him when lies nearly destroyed him. The storm had passed, the ruins had been cleared, and in their place, Marcus had built something that would last.